Hey everyone, Jamie here, and in this tutorial we're going to be talking about how we can use some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to create a pretty simple stopwatch like we see here. So this stopwatch is going to count up in increments of seconds, though you can do milliseconds if you'd like, and then we have a spot for hours, for minutes rather, and hours as well. So if we click on the start button, you'll see here that it starts counting up in 1 second increments. Once this hits 60 seconds, this will obviously flip over to 1 minute, etc., etc. If we hit the stop button here, you'll notice that the stopwatch stops at 9 seconds, and then we can go ahead and restart it again if we'd like, to keep on counting up from there. Let's say we want to reset it. All you have to do is hit the reset button, and then this button becomes start, and the stopwatch zeroes itself out. So it's a pretty cool project to practice some JavaScript, and it's actually also mobile responsive. So if you move it down to a mobile screen or tablet size, it does stay centered and look nice on all devices as well. So let's jump over to Visual Studio Code and take a look at the files that we need to create this. So what we're going to be doing is using 3 files. We're going to be using index.html, a styles.css, and a scripts.js file to create the stopwatch. And most of our code is actually going to be written in the scripts.js file. So let's just start off with index.html and get that out of the way. So what we're going to do is go ahead and create some HTML boilerplate using the Emmet plugin. So all you have to do for that is just type in an exclamation mark and hit tab, and it just kind of saves some time. We're going to go ahead and take out this title and change it to just stopwatch, and feel free to change it to whatever you'd like. And we're going to jump down into the body here, and we're going to start writing our code to display the time to the screen. So in order to do that, we're just going to go ahead and create a container. Again, we're going to use Emmet, so just type in .container tab, and that gives us our div with a class of container. Within this div here, what we're going to do is put in another div, but this time with an ID of display. So we're just going to go hash mark here and then display. And then within this div here is where we're just going to put in some placeholder text. So that's basically just going to be this here. We're going to start off with some zeros. So if we jump back over to VS Code, we can go ahead and do that. So 00, colon, 00, colon, and 00. And then what we're going to do is jump outside of this display div, and we're going to go ahead and create another div with a class of buttons to hold the start stop button as well as the reset button. So in order to do that, let's just go ahead and say buttons, and then within this we're going to go ahead and create 2 buttons. So the first one's going to be button, and we're going to give this an ID of start stop because it's going to be our start and stop button. And we're just going to give this a value of start. And then next to that button, what we're going to do is we're going to create another button. So button, going to give this one an ID of reset. And then what we're going to do is go ahead and just give it a value of reset. So let's go ahead and save this and jump over to Google Chrome to take a look at what we have so far. So looks similar, not styled as nicely, but it does look similar to what we have, and it's a good start here. Let's go over to our styles.css file now to make this look a little bit nicer. So back to VS Code, over to styles.css, and the first thing we're going to do is actually style the container div that we created. So we're going to go ahead and say .container, and within this we're just going to give it a height of 300 pixels and a width of 100%. All right, so then what we're going to do here is add in some styles for the display div. So we're going to go ahead and reference this by its ID selector, so display. And within here, we're going to give this also a width of 100%. We're going to give the font within there a font size of 72 pixels, make it nice and big. We're going to set the text align property to center. And we're going to give it a margin of 0 pixels auto. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and style up the buttons. And all I really want to do is just align them to the center. So we're just going to go .buttons. And we're going to say text align center. So if we go ahead and save these styles, jump back over to index.html and add in our styles, a reference to our styles.css page, we should see everything change and look nice. So in order to do this, we're just going to say link rel equals style sheet, and we're going to say href equals styles.css, and that's because our styles.css is in the same directory. and then we should be good to go. So let's go ahead and save this, jump back over to Google Chrome and refresh. And now we have something that's a little bit more like, or exactly like what we have here. Only difference is I put a space between the two buttons, but feel free to do whatever you'd like there. And notice too that this is also mobile responsive. So if you're looking at this on a mobile phone, you know, it should look pretty good. So let's jump back over to VS Code and start working on the JavaScript code that we're going to need to actually increment the stopwatch and to, you know, include logic to flip over to 1 minute and reset the seconds back to 0 and things like that. So back over to VS Code here and over to script.js. And the first thing we're going to be doing is actually defining some JavaScript variables to hold the seconds, minutes, and hours. So let's just create a comment here and say define vars to hold time values. So we're going to say let seconds equal 0, let minutes equal 0, and let hours equal 0. And if you want to include milliseconds or any other time value, feel free to do that as well. It's just going to require a little bit more logic to make everything look good and work properly. So the next thing we're going to do is create a function that's going to contain the logic to determine when to increment the next value, be it seconds, minutes, hours, as well as how to display that value to the user. So let's go ahead and create a comment here. We're just going to say stopwatch function, and in parentheses here we're just going to say logic to determine when to increment next value, etc. And we're just going to go ahead and create a function here and call it stopwatch. And there's going to be no parameters in this function here. And within this function, we're going to go ahead and start off by incrementing seconds. So every time this stopwatch function is called, which is going to be once per second, we're going to increment the value of seconds. So all we have to say for that is just seconds plus plus. So the next thing we're going to do is add some logic in that can be used to determine when to increment the minutes and hours sections of the stopwatch. So if we didn't add any of that logic in, what would happen is this would just keep incrementing up and up and up, and it would never switch over to minutes, and the minutes would never switch over to hours. So it would just have some weird looking stopwatch. So what we want to do for that is create some logic to determine when to flip the next value. So let's go ahead and add a comment and say logic to determine when to increment next value. And we're just going to go ahead and say if seconds divided by 60, because there's 60 seconds in a minute, is equal exactly to 1, we're going to go ahead and set seconds to 0 because we've hit 1 minute, and we're going to increment minutes. So then minutes becomes 1. And within this too, what we're going to do is nest in another if statement. So we're going to say if minutes divided by 60 is exactly equal to 1, what we're going to do then is set minutes to 0 because we've hit an hour, and then we're going to go ahead and set hours plus plus. So we're going to increment hours by 1. And that's, you know, pretty simple logic. If you had milliseconds, you could go ahead and add that before our seconds as well. So let's go ahead and actually test this out and see what it looks like. So the next thing we're going to want to do is actually write some code to display the values of the seconds, minutes, and hours to the screen. And that's going to be within our stopwatch function because we want this value to be updated once every 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. So in order to do that, we're just going to say, let's actually leave a comment to say display updated time values to user. So we're going to say document.getElement by ID. And we're going to use the display ID, so the display element that we have in our index.html. We're going to say inner HTML, and we're going to set that equal to hours plus, and then a colon, plus minutes, plus a colon, and then we'll finally concatenate on our seconds, so plus seconds. And then what we're going to do is just outside of this, we're going to say window.setInterval, and so this is going to be a function that we're going to be using to act as our timer. So every however many milliseconds we'd like, we're going to call this stopwatch function, which will then update the time. So we're going to say window.setInterval, and we're going to say let's call our stopwatch function, so stopwatch, And then we're going to add another parameter here, which is how often we want this function to be called. And we're going to do that every 1,000 milliseconds. If you wanted to test it a little bit faster, you can obviously remove a 0 and things will move a little bit quicker. So let's go ahead and save this. And let's jump over to index.html and add in our JavaScript code so that we can test this. So we're going to say script type equals text/JavaScript. And we're going to say src for source equals script.js. So if we save this and go over to Google Chrome so we can preview it, let's go ahead and refresh. And you'll notice that our stopwatch is counting up, but the trailing or leading 0 rather that we have disappears when it starts counting. And that's because we have to actually add that in as a string. And also our buttons don't work, so that we have to go back in and continue to work on those. But one quick trick that we can do is if we jump back over to VS Code and jump back over to scripts.js, we can remove a couple zeros here to make things go just a little bit faster here, and then refresh. And you'll notice that our logic is working to increment the minutes, and hopefully we can see hours here. So let's go ahead and just have this update every 1 millisecond instead of 10, and that should make things go even faster still. So once this hits 60, we should see this flip over to 1 for 1 hour. And again, feel free to add milliseconds if you'd like. We could easily do that. But the importance here is just to make sure that our logic works before we display something incorrect to the user. And it does look like everything is working as expected. So let's jump back over to VS Code, set this back to every 1,000 milliseconds, and let's start working on some code here that we can use to display a leading 0 for when we display the time to the user. So in order to do that, we're actually going to go back up to the top of our JavaScript code here, and we're going to create some more variables that we can use to hold that leading 0 or hold the display value altogether. So let's go ahead and say define vars to hold display value. So we're going to say let display seconds equal 0, let display minutes equal 0, and let display hours equals 0. So if we jump back into our stopwatch function, what we're going to do is determine when we need to set, when we need to add in a trailing 0. So outside of our conditional statement here, we're going to go ahead and say if seconds/minutes/hours are only 1 digit, otherwise, in other words 0 to 9, we'll just add a leading 0 to the value. And that's just going to make things look a little bit nicer. So we're going to say if seconds is less than 10, what we're going to do is say display seconds equals, and we're going to add in a string value of 0 plus whatever values the actual seconds or integer value of seconds is. And then we're going to put that, we're going to actually call the toString method on that to make that into a string as well. So toString, and then that should basically turn this whole value of seconds into a string. We're going to then say else. We're going to say display seconds equals seconds, and that's because we don't need to add a trailing 0 to any number that's that's greater than 9 because it already has 2 digits, or a leading 0 rather. Next thing we're going to do is say if minutes is less than 10, you guessed it, display minutes equals a string value of 0 plus minutes dot to string. Otherwise, display minutes just equals whatever minutes happens to be. And the last time, if hours is less than 10, we're going to go ahead and set display hours to a string value of 0 and concatenate on whatever the actual value of hours is, and then call the toString method on it. And then what we're just going to do is say else. If it's greater than 1 digit, just display hours is equal to just whatever the value of hours is. And because we updated the values that are actually going to be displayed, we have to go in and update the values that are being output to the display div in our HTML. So we're just going to replace hours with display hours. We're going to replace minutes with our display minutes. And we're going to replace seconds with our display seconds. So let's save this jump over to Chrome and refresh, and you'll notice that even though we have a value that is less than 2 digits in length, we're adding a leading 0 to it, and that should also carry on over to the minutes and the hours as well. So we're not done yet, and that's because we don't have any working buttons with our stopwatch. So the start and stop button and the reset button don't do anything when they're clicked. So right now when the user visits the stopwatch page, what happens is this set interval function starts running in increments at every 1,000 milliseconds. We don't want that because when the user visits the page, we want them to choose when they want to start the stopwatch, and that's just done by clicking the button. So what we're going to do is create a variable up here, and we're going to call this variable interval. So we're just going to say var to hold, or we'll say rather define var to hold set interval function. And what we're going to do is say let interval equal, we're going to start it off as null because we don't want the function to run when the user loads the page. And what we're going to do now is create a function that's going to start the stopwatch when the user clicks on the button, and then stop the stopwatch when the user clicks on the start stop button again. So we're going to say function, and we're just going to call it start stop. There's going to be no parameters for this function. And what we're going to do is say if, we're actually going to have to create another variable. So let's just jump back up to the top here and say define var to hold stopwatch status. So whether it's started or stopped. So let's say let status equal, we're going to start off with the function stopped, or with the value of the status variable equal to stopped. So we'll say if the stopwatch, or the status of the stopwatch, is equal to stopped, what we're going to do is start the stopwatch by calling the set interval function. So we'll say start the stopwatch, and we'll say by calling the set interval function. So in order to do that, we're just going to say interval, and we're just going to, oops, spelled that wrong. We're going to set it equal to this here. So now that that's not stored anywhere on the page regularly, it's not going to run when we load the page. So we're going to start this function if the stopwatch is stopped and the user clicks on the button. And then what we're going to do is say document.get element by ID, and we're going to update the value of the button to say stop, because the function is now running when they click the button. So we'll say start stop, which is the ID of the button, and we're just going to say .inner HTML equals stop. And conversely, we're going to say else if the stopwatch essentially is now started and the user clicks the button. What we're going to do is say window.clear interval. So this is going to stop the set interval function from running, and we're just going to put in the value of interval so that the code knows which set interval function to reference, and it's this one right here. And then we're going to say document.get element by ID, and we're going to say start stop .inner HTML. We're going to reset that back to the value of start because our stopwatch is now stopped. And we're just going to update the status to equal stopped. And I forgot to add it up here, but what we're going to do is say status equal started. And you can actually use Boolean values for this, so you could use a 0 or a 1 or a true and a false. But just to avoid confusion, for me at least, I find it's easier to basically, when you start the stopwatch, keep the status at started. When you stop the stopwatch, keep the status at stopped. So let's save this and then jump over to our index.html file. And what we're going to do is add an onClick value to the start button. So we're going to say onClick equals, and we're going to say start stop. And then we're going to save this, jump over to Chrome, and see if it works. So you'll notice that now the stopwatch is not running when we load the page, and that's good. So if we hit start, you'll notice that it does start running, and the value of the start stop button changes to stop. And then once we click on stop, the clear interval function is called, and we pass in the value of our set interval function, which calls the stopwatch function every 1,000 milliseconds. and that stops it here. When we click start again, it should start running again. Click stop again, it stops again, and so everything is looking good there. So the next thing we have to do is make the reset button work. So what we're going to do for that is we're going to jump back over here, and then we're going to jump back over to script.js, and then we're going to go ahead and create another function here. So we're going to say function to reset the stopwatch, and we're going to say function reset. And we're going to say whenever we click on the button here, what we want to do is clear the or stop the set interval function. So window.clear interval, and we're going to pass in the value of interval, and then we're going to set everything, all of the seconds and minutes and hour values to 0. So we're going to say seconds equals 0, minutes equals 0, and hours equals 0. And then we're going to go ahead and update the whatever is displayed to the user to be the default. So we're going to say document.getElement by ID, and we're going to update the display to be the default again. So it's just going to be a string, and it's just going to say 00:00:00:00. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set the value of the start and stop button back to start. So .getElement by ID, and we're going to say start stop, and we're going to set the inner HTML of that to start. Save it, jump over to Google Chrome, refresh. So now our function is not running. We click start, our stopwatch starts running. We click stop, it stops running. And then moment of truth here, let's start it up again, and let's just hit reset. And it keeps running. And the reason for that actually is because we forgot to add in the function call when we click on the reset button. So we just need to say onClick equals reset. So if we save that and jump back over here, let's try it again. So start, timer starts going, stop, it stops, start it again, it's going again, reset. It starts off back at 0. This button here changes back to start, and it doesn't keep going again. So if we click on start again, we should be good to go. So that is how we create a stopwatch using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Feel free to let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for this or other videos, please feel free to let me know. And feel free to follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/JamieMCG. And I thank you for watching. Have a great day.